There was a moat around the stadium, not decorative, not structural. A moat dug there because the stadium had been used as a prison to stop prisoners from escaping. 6 feet deep, filled with dirty water, running the perimeter of the playing field of the Vélez Sarsfield Stadium in Buenos Aires, Argentina, 1981. On the 28th of February, 1981, Queen flew in 40 tons of artificial grass from Los Angeles, spread it over the field, covered the moat, built a 100-foot stage at one end, and played to more than 50,000 people, the first of several. By the end of the tour, they would play to 300,000 in Buenos Aires alone. 300,000 people in a country whose military dictatorship had, in the previous years, made thousands of its own citizens disappear. 300,000 people in a stadium that had been used to hold some of them. Queen did not know the full extent of what they were standing on. Or perhaps they did. That is the question this story has been carrying for 40 years. Argentina in February 1981 was 5 years into a military dictatorship that had come to power in a coup in 1976 and that had responded to political opposition with a systematic campaign of violence now known as the Dirty War. The Dirty War was not a war in the conventional sense. It was a program of state terror directed against anyone the military government considered a threat: left-wing activists, journalists, students, trade unionists, intellectuals, and anyone associated with them. The desaparecidos were people taken from their homes or the streets, held in clandestine detention centers, tortured, and in most cases killed. Estimates of the total number of people who disappeared ranged between 10 and 30,000. The detention centers were distributed across the country, and they included, during the years of the dictatorship's greatest intensity in the late 1970s, a number of Buenos Aires' public institution schools, factories, and sports stadiums, repurposed as facilities where prisoners could be held, processed, and disposed of in the specific bureaucratic logic of state terror. Vélez Sarsfield was among them. The moat was not incidental, it was functional. Queen's decision to tour South America in 1981 was the result of a discovery that surprised the band themselves. They had become enormous in Argentina and Brazil without ever having performed. Their records had found audiences of extraordinary size and loyalty through radio and through the specific mechanisms of musical transmission that operated in South America, independently of the touring infrastructure that connected British bands to their European and North American audiences. When Queen's manager Jim Beach began receiving reports about the scale of their following in the region, the response from the band was, by his own account, genuine disbelief. Brian May has described the conversation about South America beginning with the suggestion that they could play football stadiums and the band's collective response being something close to laughter. Football stadiums in countries they had never visited, for audiences they had never played to, and then the numbers came in the actual attendance figures, the actual demand, and the laughter stopped and the planning began. Jim Beach, Queen's manager, negotiated the permission for the Buenos Aires concerts directly with an Argentine army general. The general's concern, as Beach has described it, was this: how can I possibly allow 50,000 young people into a stadium when I cannot control them? That was the question. Control. A military government asking a music manager how to control a crowd. Think about what that question reveals about how that government understood its own population. The logistics of bringing Queen to Argentina in 1981 were not simply practical. They were political, in the specific and dangerous sense that everything in Argentina was political in 1981. Jim Beach has described the negotiation with the military authorities as something he navigated with the specific care of someone who understood that the people on the other side of the table were not a conventional concert promoter's bureaucracy. The military government's concern about the concerts was twofold. They feared the gathering of large numbers of young people in a single space as a potential political threat, and they were uncertain about the logistics of managing a crowd of this scale in venues that had, until recently, been used for very different purposes. Beach's account of the negotiation, the general across the table, the question about control, the eventual agreement that involved armed guards meeting the band at the airport, and the presumed presence of secret police throughout the tour, is one of the most extraordinary pieces of context in Queen's entire touring history. They were negotiating with a government that was actively disappearing its own citizens, and the shows went ahead. What Queen brought to Buenos Aires was not a small touring package. 16 tons of scaffolding from Los Angeles, 40 tons of equipment from Miami. The artificial grass, a full football pitch of synthetic turf, was laid over the playing surface, covering the field, and with it, the moat at its perimeter. The stage was 100 feet high, 140 feet wide. The crew began construction 5 days before the first show. The Argentinian organizers, who had never seen anything like this, initially refused to believe something of this size was actually being built. They watched it go up. The scale of the production was itself a statement that whoever had come here to perform had come to take this audience seriously, to give them what they would have given any audience anywhere in the world. The moat was covered. The prisoners who had been held in this stadium were not present. The 50,000 people who filed in on the 28th of February were. The promoter of the first Buenos Aires concert said something that night that has been quoted in almost every account of this tour since. He said, "For music in Argentina, this has been a case of before the war and after the war. Queen have liberated this country, musically speaking." He used the word liberated. In a country that was still, at the moment he said it, actively imprisoning and disappearing people. The word was not metaphor, it was aspiration, and it was the sincerest thing anyone could have said. The crowd that came to the Vélez Sarsfield concerts was not simply large. It was, by every account from people who were present, journalists, band members, crew, something qualitatively different from anything Queen had experienced elsewhere. British and American audiences brought a specific relationship to Queen's music. The relationship of people who had grown up with it, who had purchased the records, who had followed the band's evolution across the decade. The Argentine crowd brought something different. They had followed the music across a distance, cultural, geographic, political, that had made the connection feel more hard-won. They knew the songs in English. In a country where very few people spoke English, they sang them back. During Love of My Life, the ballad that Freddie Mercury had begun playing as a solo piano piece, stepping back from the microphone and letting the audience carry the melody, the entire stadium sang it, word perfect, in English, without prompting. Freddie Mercury stood at the microphone and listened. He had heard audiences sing his songs before. He had not heard anything quite like this. Freddie Mercury, 34 years old, at the peak of his physical presence and his vocal power, performed on that stage in Buenos Aires with the specific quality that people who saw multiple shows on this tour have described as the best of his career. Not the most theatrical, not the most polished, the most present, the most genuinely connected to the crowd in front of him. Peter Hintz, Queen's roadie who was with the band throughout the South American tour, described the shows as something he had not seen from Queen before, a quality of reciprocal energy between the stage and the audience that the production itself could not fully account for. Freddie Mercury, wearing a yellow athletic jacket and dark-fitted trousers, moving across a stage that had been built on top of what had been, not many years before, a place where people were detained for their political beliefs and delivering, night after night, an hour and a half of music that the people in front of him had been waiting years to hear in person. The distance between those two facts, what the ground beneath the stage had been and what it was now being used for, was the specific and irreducible dimension of the Buenos Aires concerts that no account of them has ever quite resolved. The question of what Queen knew about the political context of the Buenos Aires concerts, the dirty war, the use of stadiums as detention facilities, the specific history of the ground, is one the band members have addressed only indirectly. Brian May has spoken about the South American tour with consistent warmth, describing it as one of the greatest touring experiences of his life, and acknowledged that the political situation in Argentina was something the band was aware of in general terms. Roger Taylor, backstage in Buenos Aires in 1981, said something a journalist recorded. "I don't know about this anymore. It doesn't seem right somehow with Britain in a recession." The discomfort of the scale, the sense of something not quite fitting, that is the closest any member of Queen came, in public, to addressing the full dimensions of what they were standing on. 300,000 people, in a country under a military dictatorship, in a stadium that had been used as a detention facility, on a stage built over the moat that had been dug to stop prisoners escaping. And Freddie Mercury sang, "We Are the Champions." Let that sequence settle for a moment. He sang it because it was in the set list. He sang it because the crowd needed it. He sang it because that is what Freddie Mercury did, every night, regardless of everything else. But the song and the ground and the moment make a combination that is very difficult to hold without feeling the full weight of what it contains. At the second concert at Vélez Sarsfield backstage, the band were introduced to Diego Maradona. He was 20 years old. He was already one of the most famous footballers in Argentina, already one of the most recognizable faces in the country. He came to the concert because Queen were the event of the year, and Maradona went to events. The meeting was brief, the backstage encounter of two groups of famous people in a foreign country, warm and unremarkable on its surface. But the image it produces, Freddie Mercury in Diego Maradona, in the backstage of a Buenos Aires stadium in 1981, two men who would each, in their very different ways, define the decade that followed, in a country still ruled by a military government that feared its own people, is one of the most genuinely strange images in the history of popular culture. Neither of them was thinking about what the image would mean. They were just backstage, just meeting, just two people in a room where something very large had just happened. The second leg of Queen's South American tour, in September and October 1981, brought complications that the first leg had not encountered. In Venezuela, two concerts in Caracas were canceled when the country declared a period of national mourning following the death of a former president. In Mexico, Freddie Mercury appeared on stage wearing an enormous sombrero, a gesture toward the local audience that the local audience received by throwing shoes at the stage. He collected the shoes, thanked the crowd, and called them a bunch of tacos. The show continued. These incidents, the canceled Venezuelan shows, the Mexican shoe throwing, have been treated in most accounts as the comic footnotes of a tour that was primarily defined by the enormous and extraordinary Buenos Aires and São Paulo concerts. But they are also evidence of something real about what it was like to be Queen on that tour. The specific combination of ambition and improvisation, of genuine commitment to the audiences and genuine incomprehension of the cultural context in which those audiences existed, that made the South American tour one of the most remarkable and most complicated things Queen ever did. Queen never returned to South America. The Falklands War began in April 1982, 3 months after the tour ended, and the specific political conditions that had made the Argentine concerts possible and the specific relationship between a British band and an Argentine audience were permanently altered. They had planned a second tour of Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay for October and November 1983. The tickets existed, the posters existed, the tour never happened. They never went back. The legacy of Queen's 1981 South American tour in Argentina and Brazil has outlasted every other aspect of the band's touring history in terms of its sustained cultural presence. 40 years later, Brian May still performs Love of My Life as a solo piece at every Queen plus Adam Lambert concert in South America, and he steps back from the microphone and the audience still sings it, word perfect, in English, in the same way the crowd at Vélez Sarsfield sang it in 1981. He has described these moments as among the most overwhelming experiences of his performing life. The specific quality of that connection, a British guitarist, the song of his dead friend, an Argentine crowd singing it back in a language that is not their own, in a stadium that is now a clean and ordinary sports venue where the moat has been filled in and the history has been absorbed into the ground, is the most durable evidence of what the 1981 concerts were and what they meant. The ground has changed. The song has not. The crowd has not. The singing continues. Queen played to 300,000 people in Buenos Aires, and the promoters said they had liberated the country, musically speaking, and Freddie Mercury stood on a stage built over a moat that had been dug to stop prisoners escaping and sang, "We Are the Champions," and the crowd sang it back in English. The moat was covered. The stage was enormous. The night was extraordinary, and underneath the artificial grass, 6 feet down, The moat was still there. It had not gone anywhere. It just had 50,000 people singing on top of it.